Good. All right. Hi, everyone. I am Mariam. I'm the director of the Georgian Center for Strategy and Development. And it is my pleasure and honor to give you all a very warm welcome to today's discussion, where once again, we will be addressing the myths and misconceptions that exist in the debate about Russia. Now, this talk is, of course, based on the brilliant publication by the Chatham House, where a lineup of outstanding field experts take on some of the most prevalent myths that exist in the West in relation to Russia and how they affect policy in this direction. Today, we're very, very lucky to have two of the authors with us, Sir Andrew Wood, who is an associate fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, where he focuses on Russia's domestic and foreign policies. He was British ambassador to Yugoslavia from 1985 to 1989 and ambassador to Russia from 1995 to 2000, having earlier served in Moscow in the 60s and early 80s. After his retirement from the diplomatic service in 2000, he acted on behalf of a number of firms with interests in Russia and other formerly Soviet countries. And we also have Mateo Bouleg, who is a research fellow. In his research, Mateo focuses on Eurasian security and defense issues, as well as on Russia's foreign policy and military affairs. Part of his research addresses Russia-NATO relations, Russia-China defense and security affairs, and the Arctic military security issues. He graduated from Sciences Po Toulouse in France and King's College in London. He has an MA in International Conflict Studies. So, gentlemen, hello and welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Mariam. Good to be here.
For me, it's good. Discussions in Georgia are always good.
So before we dive into the discussion, I will make a very short introduction of why it is that we're here. When the original document was first published, it felt natural to have something like this translated into Georgian. Why? Maybe a question. Well, because A, here in Georgia, we're no strangers to myths and misconceptions about Russian Federation and its policies, and B, we are no strangers to how Russia chooses to wield its power. And so to me, A plus B equals the need for constant in-depth analysis of how Russia operates, how it's run, how it changes and adapts to challenges and new realities, but also, and perhaps more importantly, to how it creates new realities. And rarely, if ever, playing by the rules that we all so affectionately call international law or norms. So I thought we need this document to exist in Georgian language so that everyone here can have access to it. At GCSD, we strongly believe that perhaps not having the best command of English language should never be an obstacle for a person seeking high quality intellectual material. So immediately after reading the introduction of the report and myth 1, I reached out to my dear friend at Chatham House, and then I managed to bother everyone at Chatham House. But what matters is that the Georgian version of the publication now exists and is available for everyone to enjoy. And at this point, I'm going to ask Nico, if possible, to repost and relink the Georgian version of the document in the comment section. And so for this opportunity, I have to thank Benjamin Wakefield, Lyubitsa Polakova, Adam Kowalski, and James Nixie. The collective effort of these wonderful people made this possible, and for that I am eternally, eternally grateful. I'm also immensely grateful to the brilliant speakers of our first panel, the amazing James Scher, the wonderful Katarina Volchuk, and the brilliant Dr. Ben Noble, who, by the way, has a new book out, which I think we should all read. So the last time, Ben told us about internal governance in Russia and the extent to which it is all single-handedly run by Putin. Katarina spoke about the comparison between the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union and whether or not the latter can actually be seen as an instrument of economic integration. Finally, James Scher dissected the myth that Russians and Ukrainians, nay, James Scher annihilated the myth that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. And today we will discuss two more myths, one that supports or perpetuates the idea that Russia is not in conflict with the West, and one that claims that West should make concessions to Russia, even if Russia makes no such concessions in return. So before I give the floor to our speakers, I'd like to encourage our viewers to ask their questions in the comment section. And I would also like to ask my team to send in those questions as we get them. after the presentations, I will, of course, ask those questions. I will have a mix of my own questions as well as the audience questions. So again, I will now give the floor to our speakers. And without further ado, Mathieu, the floor is yours. Once again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Mariam and Nico, for the organization as well. It's great to be here. So it might sound very strange for a predominantly Georgian audience to discuss, this myth that we still have in the Western policy circles that Russia is actually not that bad in terms of its willingness to conduct aggressive, if not military, foreign policy. Georgia and Ukraine have been directly on the front line of said militarized foreign policy. So it might sound a bit discomforting for a Georgian audience, but bear with me, because this is very much a view that we have in these Western policy circles, that the Kremlin is actually up to something good with us, at least the current leadership. So in this paper, this myth that Russia is not in a conflict with the West, or not in a state of almost war with the West, it really is about arguing about the Kremlin's self-perception and projected foreign policy objectives that really are one of conflict and confrontation with the Western-led liberal order, with NATO in particular, also with its allies, and I'm thinking about Georgia and Ukraine specifically. So this is really far from the sort of rosy image that we might still have in Western policy circles, that we can still achieve some sort of cooperation with the Kremlin leadership in its present form, or build trust with Moscow because they're actually up to help us. And I argue that this vision is very much misguided. So I'll explain the why, the how, and the so what we should do about it in this presentation. Concerning the why, so this is nothing new for a country like Georgia, of course. The Kremlin, in its current form and leadership, defines itself in a form of protracted conflict with the Western-led liberal institutional order, mostly NATO in that regard, and is waging a symmetric warfare against our interests. So this is very much a political and moral, if not maybe perhaps civilizational confrontation. It's very unpalatable and very hard to accept for Western policymakers because it really changes the narrative and changes the lens through which we engage and understand the Russian challenge or the Russian leadership. And to make the point home, I'm referring here to the statement by Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov in Russia recently, who said that the United States, and I quote, are an adversary to the interests of Russia. This is very much written as well in the National Security Strategy that was released over the summer 2021, where you can see there is absolutely no mention of potential cooperation with the West, and it has been replaced by very tough rhetoric concerning the threats that NATO in particular, but also Western interests pose to the Kremlin and to the Kremlin leadership in particular when it comes to these projected fifth column color revolutions or Trojan horses that the sort of Western CIA Soros influenced plot would try to undermine the Russian leadership. All of this is unchallengeable. All of this is self-constructed. And all of this is influencing the way Russian foreign policy is projecting itself in terms of grievances, in terms of besieged fortress, and almost like a wartime mentality. And this is feeding a lot of misconceptions in Russian foreign policy as well concerning spheres of influence or concerning the threats caused by NATO's expansion. And I'm referring here to this myth that our colleague John Knopf is debunking as well concerning the fact that NATO is out there to invade Russia, or out there to get us, quote unquote. So all of this is feeding great power propaganda, which makes deterrence really hard to achieve in essence, because it is hard to deter a worldview. It's really hard to deter a narrative that is feeding both your foreign policy externally, but also the way you control your population internally. And this is where you have a clear link between internal and foreign policy in Russia, concerning the fact that all of these misconceptions about the intentions or the nature of the West are fueling and informing military doctrines and are further militarizing society in Russia through official politics and also through the use of the church, for instance, as a tool of control and propaganda. So this is very much a war and a conflict, not through old-style wars with tanks and so on, but mostly through other means and other tools. And I'm referring here to what we call generally a sort of umbrella term of hybrid warfare, but I think is also misguided in terms of what it really means. It is very much understood in the Kremlin as a continuum between military and non-military operations. Because the Kremlin defines itself in a sort of initial period of war with Western interest, it is very much trying to achieve military superiority through the use of information manipulation, psychological destabilization, influence operation, and below the threshold, non-conventional warfare. The problem is that these means are not just sub-threshold, but do impact countries on the eastern flank of the Atlantic Alliance, and specifically its partners, Ukraine and Georgia, when Russia is using calculated risk and using brute force and the threat of military force when necessary, when it feels it can achieve something, or when it feels like it is losing something in return. So all of this is sort of fueling this misconception about the fact that Russia only uses force against non-NATO countries, but is also waging asymmetric warfare against our interests. So very much everybody's on the same boat. This is the logic of sort of sub-threshold and below threshold warfare, and a continuum once again between military and non-military probing. So how does this translate into policy? Well, the problem in the West in general, when you look at the way NATO countries or in general countries in the European Union have been transcribing their perceptions about Russian foreign policy in action, we very generally assume that the Kremlin is interested in dialogue or is interested in confidence building measures with us. Or we also assume very wrongly that it's still possible to discuss and try to bridge existing antagonisms because we can still achieve a form of negotiation with the current leadership. Well, all of these things are generally misguided because we don't really factor in our approach this logic that the Kremlin is already far gone in its approach to what it wants to achieve with the West. Once again, the Russian leadership assumes that we are already in a state of conflict, which means a certain number of processes, rules of engagement, standard operating procedure, and this sort of sub-threshold destabilization, which means that they are planning for wars, not just battles. They have a clear vision of what a theory of victory looks like, or what a war termination strategy looks like. Things that we are way, way, way behind in terms of thinking in the West, because we still assume that we can have dialogue. We still assume that we can still have a discussion and hope to achieve something. And this something is exactly what Andrew will be discussing. So when we do try to engage these dialogues, it's always very painful to see, because if you look at the recent examples with President Macron in France, for instance, with this perception that we can have a sort of reset or we can have a form of dialogue with the current leadership, that always ends up in tears because we end up acknowledging that it is not really possible to achieve any sort of confidence building, or when we do dialogue for the sake of it, like a sort of box checking exercise where dialogue is an end in itself, but without really any sort of policy discussions behind it. And the problem is that it is fueling the Kremlin sense of self-importance, because Moscow doesn't have to do anything, and we run to the Kremlin in the sense that whenever there is an issue in the world, and generally issues that the Kremlin is really good at either creating or sustaining, and I'm thinking about the conflict in Georgia or the war in Ukraine, is that we generally try to run to the Kremlin and assume that it is by making concessions in the first place that we will achieve something, or in a way achieve respect from the Kremlin. All of this is once again extremely misguided and feeding these policy and these perceptions. So what should we do about it in the end? And what should better policy look like for us if we want to achieve something, not just rhetorically about dialogue, but also understanding where the Kremlin is going with this warpath mentality? we are generally really tough in the way that we use words. If you look at, for instance, the American language about Russia, calling the Kremlin strategic competitor, or in the UK, the Integrated Review that was recently published that calls Russia a systemic competitor. So we really do, we don't assume Russia is necessarily always a threat, but it's definitely a competitor and a challenger to our interests, even though the Kremlin is a completely different level of understanding of our own interests. But if you start calling Russia a competitor, it vindicates the Kremlin's worldview that they don't have to do much to be considered a challenge. But it also is a problem because it is vindicating the Kremlin that they're doing something right, and it comes with a responsibility for us that we are still placing Russia on the same level of challenge as China, for instance, which is increasingly becoming present in the debate as a next level of competition. So by calling Russia a competitor systemically, then we still place it on the same par as China or NATO. So it is really vindicating the Kremlin's belief that all of what they're doing, these sub-threshold destabilization, these very cheap information warfare maneuvers, are really working and are really leading to our own self-deterrence. And this is one of the issues that we have, is that we don't really test the Kremlin's pain threshold. We don't really test Russian reactions for fear that it would escalate, for fear that it would be damaging in terms of our own reputation in our body politic in the West, and therefore generally understood as off the table. If we don't test, if we don't probe, we won't achieve anything. And this leads to self-deterrence in a way. We remove all the escalatory options from the table because they could be damaging for us. And this is very much something that is irrigating Western policy thinking, especially at NATO level. So the first thing to do would be to try to go into a different approach to deterrence, to understand finally that Russia has hostile intentions against us, and especially the Russian leadership at this stage, of course, not the Russians themselves, but very much the Kremlin leadership, to try to change the narrative and sort of change the tables on how we approach deterrence, specifically what I call deterrence outside the box, which is not just doing local deterrence by punishment, as is done by NATO in general with these reinforcements and these tripwires, but also trying to be more proactive in the way we approach gray zone deterrence, so cross-domain deterrence, so deterrence by surprise in a way, to not just respond, but also be a bit more anticipatory or seize the initiative and leads to more operational surprise in the way we push back against Russian actions. Another thing to be mindful of is to establish coherence in our approach. It is important not just to deter for the sake of it, or to push back for the sake of it, but also to have a discussion about what is achievable and what is desirable with and from the current Kremlin leadership. Because without a desired end state, without discussing on what it is we hope to achieve and what does successful deterrence or successful defense look like, then we won't be able to have a clear answer to where we want to place Russia in this sort of foreign policy basket. Ideally, a desired end state would be to reduce opportunities for Russia to harm our interest and the interest of our allies in the West. And I'm thinking specifically about Georgia and Ukraine. Admitting that we sort of need to force the Kremlin to rethink its cost-benefit analysis and acting in a very nefarious way against us. But all of this needs first, to achieve this, to have a baseline of understanding of how we approach the Kremlin. Because all the efforts that we have at engaging Russia will lead to failure and will lead to disappointment and constant cycles of disappointment and re-enchantment that we can achieve something. And this, I'm taking the language used by our colleague Keir Giles in his book Moscow Rules, where he talks about this constant cycle of sort of re-enchantment, disappointment, of reaching out to the Kremlin. We've seen it with the different resets in the United States. We've seen it with the Macron initiative in 2019 that has led to absolutely nothing. And this might be another watershed moment for this new strategic stability initiative led by the United States, whereby if we don't really have a desired end state of what success would look like without conceding to the Kremlin or offering olive branches, then this will further lead to another cycle of disappointment that will be forgotten by the new elites, that will be forgotten because of the absence of muscle memory in our body politic, and that will lead to further disappointment. So in a way, it really is about understanding a sort of baseline between us. So I call it a dialogue of differences between us at the level of the alliance, at the level of the European Union, and with our allies. And I'm thinking specifically about Georgia and Ukraine because of the learning curve and the sort of operational experience that countries like Georgia and Ukraine have in fighting directly a war with the Kremlin, in terms of what it is that we want to achieve at the end of the day, and not just run to the Kremlin because we have to. So it is very hard to accept, of course, because accepting this level of confrontation leads to different policy choices about where we place the Kremlin in terms of not just competition, but actual threat to our interest. And this is something that is really hard to sell to politicians and policymakers in the West. But fundamentally, the foundation of this relationship is one of confrontation, is one of competition, and is one of damage control in a way. It is a new normal that we need to live with. And it is a new normal that will probably outlast the current leadership. This is not just a Putin thing. And this is something that is endearing in the way the Kremlin is approaching foreign policy in general. So what we need to do is accept this adversarial confrontation and deal with it the best way possible. Also by learning from countries like Georgia and Ukraine who have been at the front line of these things. And finally, it is very much a question about internal resilience. By protecting our societies from within and preventing the Russian leadership from doing harm in the first place. And I'm thinking specifically about influence operations and information warfare. The logic, a bit like COVID, if you will, is to immunize or vaccinate the population against misinformation by providing with active citizens better tools to consume information, better tools to be challenging the narrative that the Kremlin is sending in terms of propaganda, in terms of influence and nefarious operations against us. And this is particularly important if you look at the reforms done in Georgia for the past few years concerning this whole of society or this whole of government approach that leads to better coordination of policies and better coordination of efforts with a clear desired end state in mind, which is to protect and make the populations more resilient when it comes to these influence operations, because Georgia is already one step further than NATO countries in terms of being in an actual state of conflict with Russia. And the Georgian body politic and the population, as the Ukrainians, have already made that step, that it is very much a confrontation. So it is up to us to sort of understand it as well from our point of view, from our capitals in European countries or at NATO level, that you need to encapsulate, make societies more resilient, and protect them the best we can, this sort of whole of society approach. So I will stop there and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mateo. Thank you very much for this overview of the myth and the debunking of the myth that you've authored in this publication. I think you pointed out several very, very important things that I've made several notes, and I'll try to sort of comment on just a couple of them. You mentioned that sometimes the West finds itself in a position of sort of running towards the Kremlin. And a lot of what you described to me is indicative of the inherent truth, which you also described, that there's this inherent value-based difference between the West and Russia. And I know that James Scher in his myth number 1 discusses the idea of whether or not Russia and the West are just as bad. But when we talk about things like Russia is entitled to a sphere of influence, and your myth that the West should be making concessions without Russia making such concessions in return, Russia, the idea that Russia would not need to make any concessions in return, or that Russia is entitled to its spheres of influence, that's very much within the Russian sort of narrative. That's very much within their interest. So I think even the fact that the West sometimes finds itself in the position of sort of running to Kremlin and sort of reacting to some of the things that the Kremlin does, I think it's indicative of the fact that the West plays by the completely different set of rules. And the other thing I think you mentioned is the ambition to reset relations, which I think happens to many world leaders, and especially in the US. I think it's been the ambition of every president to, I'll be the one to reset the relationship, and I'll be the one to change the relationship. And like you said, it always ends in tears. One last thing, I'm glad you mentioned Kaya Giles in general, and then his article. I've been reading that article that what deters Russia. He says, the essential precondition for attempting the deterrence is to define what interests are to be defended by the West. And I think this is very much in line with your line of reasoning. And Nico, I sent you the link to the article I just mentioned. It's called "What Deters Russia," and I was wondering if you could kindly post it in the comment section so that the viewers can have access to it. It's a very, very interesting article. I would encourage everyone to read it. There's many other things that you mentioned that I think are worth coming back to, but I think we'll do that in the Q&A session, if you don't mind. And now I will give the floor to Andrew. Andrew, once again, thank you very much for being with us.
It's my pleasure. I look forward to the discussion because that's usually the most stimulating part of the event. And I'm grateful to Mateo for saying what he did, which leaves me in a sense having to ad-lib as I go along. I want to start by saying that the difficulty, I think, for the Western attitudes is that we're still very much governed by the experience of the Cold War. It was possible during the Cold War until the breakdown of the Soviet Union to more or less contain a discussion, and it was about specific measures. And we did agree certain amount of measures, some of them in terms of inherited supposition, that is, if the Soviet Union went in and smashed the Hungarian Revolution, for example, there wasn't anything we could do about it. And if we attempted to do anything about it directly, that would make things more dangerous still. You can repeat that with other countries, obviously, but it was a fact that the West then more or less accepted the sphere of influence, if you like to call it that, that the Soviet Union had outside its borders. That we don't have, nor do we have, in that context, the continuation of the possibility of internal change in Russia when it became an independent state. Under Putin, that's gone into reverse. For Putin and for many Russians, what happened was that Russia was defeated. Russia was defeated, not just the Soviet Union, but Russia. And that's at the heart of their continued resentment, their continued supposition that inherently Russia not only had the right, but the Soviet Union was a society which was valid and would have continued, but without recognizing the dreadful experience it was for many people, including in Russia, to be in the Soviet Union and the way it developed under Stalin and so on. All that is set to one side and replaced by the supposition that the West, at that time, plotted to undo the Soviet Union and plotted against the Russian people and so on and so forth. It's a very natural reaction on the part of Russian politicians and many Russian people, because it's equally natural to remember the past and to try to forget the evil in the past, which in fact caused your destruction. It's easy to blame it onto everybody else. That's a very strong motive, I think, on the Russians' part. And that was particularly exacerbated by the I think that the Russia under Yeltsin still had a chance of evolving in a more liberal sort of way. But I recall in that context a remark made to me when I left Yugoslavia by Slobodan Milosevic, when I said to him that he should be careful because if you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. And he said, "You've never understood that people are grateful for order." That's also pretty much the answer that Putin was making towards the implied problem that he inherited. He's always been against change in Russia and for imposing the possibility of change. And that's driven him into a very serious position now, where his rule is actually under threat from the Russian people. In that context, Mateo was right to remark that the Russian people and the Russian regime should be separated from each other. That is actually essential. We should have that attitude. But the beginning premise was that during the Cold War, I think we developed a persistent supposition that all problems with Russia could be settled by negotiation. That's not the Russian assumption at all. The Russian assumption is that they have to defeat us and to impose their own resolution of issues. Mateo mentioned Georgia, of course, and Ukraine, of course, but I would like to point to also to Belarus in that context. What we're seeing there, it seems to me, is a, well, you may think this is a disgusting analogy, but there are insects that lay their eggs inside another insect and therefore kill it and take it over and eat it. And that is a reasonable analogy of what Russia is actually doing by increasing its military standing and its alliance with Lukashenko, or replacement of Lukashenko, by the same sort of tyranny that they have in Russia itself. So I think that the scene that Mateo set is correct. Returning to the Western side, it seems to me that we are more divided than we were certainly during the Cold War, when NATO was an essential instrument and an essential instrument which made decisions. That is less so than it was. The fact that Merkel and Macron are now going to speak to the Russians about the energy difficulties that the Russians have raised, will be seen in Moscow as a justification of what they've done and a confirmation of the fact that they are able to bully us into concessions in order to get particular things that only Russia can offer. That's dangerous. And it's a continuation of this idea that we have to treat Russia first because it's very powerful and so on and so forth. Because in general, quote, dialogue, unquote, with Russia is a good thing and a necessary thing, without defining what that dialogue is. So again, I strongly agree with what Mateo said about us needing to have a clear set of ideas as to what it is that we need for constructive cooperation in Europe, continental Europe, I mean. And of that, the vital part is that Russia should not try to create, by dominating other states, other independent states, a sort of defensive network around it. First of all, that won't work. You can't, the experience of the Soviet Union was that, right, they established dominance in Czechoslovakia or in Hungary or to a degree in Poland. But in the end, they could not actually rule those countries and control those countries. The same is just as strong today, if not more strong. I do not believe that the people of Belarus or of Georgia or of Ukraine are going to be happy with Russian rule in the manner particularly is rule Putin rules in Russia upon them. I doubt if they'd be happy with it anyway, but in any case, that I don't think is going to be stable from the point of view of Russia, particularly as Russia is undergoing a process of internal disintegration in its own right. The recent elections in Russia were not just false, But if you look at the proportion of United Russia's members, which were in fact elected, despite all the effort that was put into it by the central authorities, was about 30% or 35%. That was the real result. Turns out they've got it one that is fake. So I think we also have to be aware of the possibility, or in my view, the probability, that going further down this path of enforced control from the top, trying to control the press, trying to control all ideas within Russia, will result in a stable outcome. I don't think it will. So I think we also have to take that into our account. I did find actually writing the piece that I did write rather an odd experience, because the answer seemed to me so blindingly obvious, and always was obvious. I mean, I've been in Russia 3 times. I've been in Yugoslavia twice. And the supposition that you can have a dialogue which is based on some sort of mutual agreement, with taking into account what the other side is really thinking and believing, and what their motives are, is impossible. Right now, Putin does not wish to negotiate about anything. Right now, he's put himself into a bind where, in a way, he cannot negotiate about anything. His only card, his biggest card with the Russian people, and it is essentially, we are a great power. Look at it, we've got lots of fine military people and everybody has to obey us, and if they don't obey us, that's because they've been motivated by the West and so on and so forth. I don't think it's particularly persuasive, but it does appeal to some proportion of Russian people. I don't think, however, it can last. The economy is in a mess. The actual organization of the political system there is arbitrary. The very fact that so many younger people in Russia will prefer, if they can, to leave or generate to live in a better country than it is telling. So I think that we in the West have hesitations and divisions, which we do. The same is true of Russia. It seems to me that there are more people in Ukraine that would prefer to make Ukraine a fully independent state which can manage itself well, or you can tell me if it's true or not, but in Georgia, I would make the same assumption, and also in Belarus, which I would compare what Putin is doing is more like Perón in Argentina, or I forget his name anyway, Chavez, I think it was, in Venezuela. In the end, it leads to chaos. And that, I think, is the real danger that faces us. We have to deal with the regime and those in charge of it, but we must also be sure to deal as best we can with the ambitions or hopes of the Russian people, and there is a division there. But as I said, I did find it a bit difficult to write. As I wrote it, the situation in Russia seemed to get worse, because it started, I first wrote it in 2019, then we had 2020, and 2021 has been more terrible still. You cannot trust this regime. It's impossible, in my view. I'm sorry it was a bit ad hoc that I spoke like that, but anyway, we can start a discussion on that basis, I hope. I agree with Matthew at all.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Let me see if I can sort of tie 2 things that have been mentioned during the presentations together to then come to my question. Mateo, you said that this is the West is in sort of damage control mode, and that the confrontational behavior, it will outlast Putin's regime. Correct me if I'm misquoting you or if I misunderstood you, but I think this was my takeaway. And then Andrew, you said that Putin is sort of inherently against any change, and if nothing else, then at least the last election was a very good demonstration of how much that man is terrified of any change, especially the change that sort of takes the power away from him, and that's understandable. But here's my question: if we do have this understanding that the confrontation will outlast this current regime, which, as you rightly mentioned, Andrew, is impossible to talk to, it's impossible to work with them, with the current regime. If we say that this confrontational behavior or attitude will outlast this regime, then what are the powers today in today's Russia, that I suppose the West could be more optimistic about, should there be any change? But also, and perhaps more importantly, to like our own interest in Georgia and Ukraine, because we've been mentioning Georgia and Ukraine naturally as part of this discussion, the powers that Georgia and Ukraine could expect some more sort of reasonable behavior from. And part of the reason I ask this question is that, for instance, we talk a lot about Navalny, right? But the attitude towards Navalny, at least in Georgia, is not that straightforward. He has a mixed record when it comes to things that are of crucial interest and importance to us. So I suppose my question is a two-part one. Are there any powers today in Russia that the West could be more optimistic about in the long run, but the ones that could also sort of mean a little more stability or a little more constructive behavior and dialogue for the frontline states like Georgia and Ukraine?
If you're asking me,
it's for both, yeah.
I think powers there aren't any powers in Russia apart from those being held by the regime and the most brutal aspects of it, in the simple definition of the word powers. I do not, however, think that Russia can possibly prosper without having some sort of proper dialogue with its own population. It may be too much to say so, but I think Putin's real problem, or Russia's real problem, is internal. We are a threat, and you are a threat, and Ukraine is a threat, and Belarus is a threat, because we have other ideas which are inimical from the point of view of the people in charge in Russia. There is no sensible case for the idea that the United States is going to invade and take parts of Russia to be its own territory to exploit, and so on and so forth. They say that, and I think in some ways they actually at the top believe that, because it's a pretty narrow circle at the top making what is the backbone of policy. Internally, there are other powers in the regions, for example, that don't wish to be dominated like that. There is the presence and possibility of a revival of discussion within Russia as to what should be done. It's a fact that Putin will die one day, that when he gets weaker, the people around him who are profiting, that is the most direct people, will look for how they can benefit from that, to put it bluntly. That itself will cause disruption and chaos. Actually, the idea of having someone who would take the Gorbachev route in Russia, if I could put it like that, would be very difficult. If you seriously wish to reform the economy, if you seriously want to free the press, if you seriously want a proper system of law and so on and so forth, that would be potentially a recipe for chaos too. In my most gloomy moments, I don't see anything else but chaos coming out of change, whereas not having change is a recipe for disintegration also. I would like to be wrong, but that would be my attitude. I don't think anyone can know. But the fate of Venezuela or Cuba or most countries going down that route is depressing.
Really is.
But from the point of view of what the West should do, Mateo set out what we need to do in the interim. I think we should certainly, in that context, be as supportive as we possibly can be to countries directly affected by Russia, such as Georgia or Ukraine and so on. And that the idea that we should somehow give prominence or preference to what the Russians think above everything else is a profound mistake. It's not just they don't deserve it, just also that will not be a lasting solution. It's critical, that's all.
Yeah, if I can add a few more things, I fully agree with what Andrew said. I think there's a sort of wishful thinking in Western capitals, and this is very prominent in the United States right now, that what may come out of after Putin would be better or will change for the better, that we might have a sort of this belief that we might have a liberal Democrats that will tether or bring Russia to the to Western interest. So of course all of this is fundamentally wrong, because I don't think we can necessarily assume that what comes out after Putin is necessarily better, not least because we might have some more nationalist elites in place, and because the power politics of Putinism will not disappear once Putin is gone. The system will remain, and specifically the younger generation who have been not brainwashed, because this would be a step too far, but have been living under this Putinistic politics in terms of allegiance to the center, in terms of positioning themselves in the networks of power and so on. So it permeates Russian society, it permeates control of Russian society through fear, through great power politics, through patriotic military education, through the bunkerization of Russian politics and culture and so on. So I think it would be wrong to assume that what comes next will be better. But I think it's also part of our own mistake in the West to assume this a bit on purpose, maybe, because if you think that what will happen next will be better, then you can give yourself the time to say, well, we can just start ignoring Russia right now because there's no discussing with the Kremlin in its current form. So let's hope that what happens next will be better. And therefore we can sort of ignore Russia and focus on China, which is one of the things you see in Washington, DC these days, is that it's very much about China, China, China. And there is less interest in working on Russia or to be engaging with the Kremlin because, quote unquote, Russia is a declining power. And this is also something you can see in a lot of the policy discussions, that since Russia is declining, then we don't need to engage with the Kremlin so much because we can just wait it out in terms of what comes next. So it's also quite dangerous to argue that Russia, is in decline, whether it's geopolitical, economic, or demographic decline, because a declining Russia might actually make it a more dangerous Russia, or a weaker Russia might actually make it a more risk-prone Kremlin, where they would be willing to take more risks against Western interests or take more negative action against us. So it's a very complicated balance to walk. The sort of positive outlook I see in there is that there is also willingness in the Kremlin to avoid unnecessary escalation, to avoid anything that would lead to miscalculation or tactical errors that would degenerate into more conflict. And this is maybe the essence of the strategic stability dialogue that you start small, you start with technical things in the military to military level, in the things that do matter, and then you build from there. You won't build trust, of course, you won't build confidence, but at least you can avoid, conflict in where it does matter in terms of calculated interest and selective engagement on a mutual basis, where we want to avoid miscalculation and specifically accidents. So, I take it as a very, dual track approach on us avoiding to put the Kremlin in a sort of declining state, because whether or not it is declining is not the problem. We still need to consider Russia as a threat and a challenge in the current form of leadership and the next, but also engaging in a more elaborate and smarter way than we used to do. And maybe this is the hope that we have with the strategic stability dialogue led by Washington, that it will stay away from high power politics, high level politics, and try a reset, but actually discuss the low level technical problem solvers. And this is, we can't make the economy of completely ignoring the Kremlin. That's what I was saying, Mariam, earlier, that we constantly run to the Kremlin, yes, but we also need to run when it matters. So we should choose more carefully when to walk, when to run, and when to sprint. And right now we need to sprint about mitigating the risk of miscalculation and tactical errors when the red lines are crossed and when we have a problem or an incident. Otherwise, yes, we should also learn not to always go, to the Kremlin, because we always assume that we need the Kremlin, as I was saying, to solve all the problems that we have in the world. But it's also a fallacy when you look at the list of issues we need, the Kremlin's help. It's mostly issues that Russia's created in the first place: Ukraine, Georgia, Syria. So, Russia is really good at becoming front and center of solving the problems they created in the first place, whereby we agree that, yeah, we need Russia to solve these issues. Yeah, but they were responsible for them. So it's a bit of a it's reflexive control. It's using psychological destabilization to make us believe we do need the Kremlin for these things. So it's quite quite smart when you think about it.
All right, thank you for that. Before I move on with the next questions, I would like to take this moment to once again encourage the people that may be watching us right now to ask your questions in the comment section. Nico is there to send me those questions, so feel free to ask those questions, and then I'll make sure to pass them along to our speakers. Also, one thing on a very personal note, in preparation to the talks such as this one, you try to prepare for everything and you try to anticipate all things that may go wrong. And sometimes it's the internet connection, or it may be the internal workings of Zoom and Facebook. And sometimes you fail to take into consideration the light in your room. So if at some points I look like weird things are happening to me, I apologize for that. I'm not very good at being an interviewer. I'm a humble person just beginning in this field. So right now that we've established that I look like a modern art painting, I will move on to my next question. And if I may move a little sort of beyond specifically the myths that the two of you have authored, and this is something that Andrew and I discussed very briefly in one of the sort of earlier meetings and calls that we've had, again in preparation for this particular call. One of the myths that is brilliantly laid out in this publication is that Russia was promised that NATO would not enlarge. And that is definitely something that I've come across here in Georgia as well by certain individuals, sort of perpetuated and put forth by certain individuals. And a lot of people do believe that Russia was indeed promised that NATO would not enlarge, and that of course means Georgia and Ukraine and other countries that may be looking for potential membership. I was wondering if I could ask you, Andrew, but also Mathieu, if you want to comment on that, to help us debunk that myth too.
It is absolutely untrue. No such question was ever put to the Western side. I was in Washington as a deputy head of mission during the 4+2 talks. That subject never arose. The only question was related to what used to be the German, quote, democratic, unquote, republic. And that was whether that would be in NATO or not. It had to be in, but it was agreed that the NATO troops, as NATO troops, would not be moved into East Germany. At that time, people weren't even thinking about the possibility of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact altogether, although it was obviously rather likely. When the question of whether Czechoslovakia could, as it was then, would join and so on, again, there was no questions about troops like that. Secondly, this discussion always ignores the fact that any of the countries that were liberated, allowed to behave like independent countries, which was the agreement and the necessary agreement. At that time, Russia itself was pretty divided, and we had a lot of discussion as to whether it was going to be red or brown or what sort of country it was going to be. So it wasn't just a matter of abstract fear out of experience that countries like Poland had of Russia. It was because Russia was then seen as unstable and a threat. Thirdly, one obvious solution would have been for those countries to join the European, I don't think it was called Union then, but anyway, the European Union as it now is, which the European Union, or all of us in it, didn't really want to, because they had not themselves evolved in a way which was sufficiently securely democratic, and economic reform and so on would be necessary for them to be there. So it's a myth that was enthusiastically seized upon in Russia, that this was a promise, including because a number of people in NATO countries were worried that we could actually defend those other countries because they were themselves unclear as to about exactly where they would go and so on and so forth. But anyway, the allegation is fundamentally and provably false.
If I can jump on that, to build on Andrew's point. So it doesn't really matter in a way, because whatever the truth, you can never know for sure. To quote, leading social media expert Donald Trump, the truth doesn't really matter, because we have, you can find arguments for and against that. Yes, there was this comma in this document that says yes or the opposite, but we have to live with the consequences of the fact that fundamentally the Kremlin has been shaping its foreign policy perceptions around the logic that we've betrayed them into expanding NATO. So, whatever we found as a smoking gun of proof that it isn't true, we still have to live with these consequences, because the Kremlin's foreign policy perceptions are unchallengeable. Whatever we present, whatever we say, it'll be distorted and used against us, whatever the truth is. So it doesn't really matter. And this sense of betrayal has been fueling this grievance narrative in the Kremlin leadership, that we did not take their legitimate security interests into consideration, quote unquote, concerning European security, concerning their spheres of influence, with this logic that we should have buffer zones in Europe and so on, which are things that we cannot accept, of course, but things that the Kremlin feels cheated about, that we did not consult them sufficiently enough. So, I would argue, I'm not a historian. I don't have, I have my personal opinion about it. And I think it's close to what Andrew said, but it doesn't really matter. We just have to live with the consequences, and these consequences are very complicated to deal with. Andrew, you have a two-finger on that.
No, I agree. I think that is a very acute, because the real problem for the people in the Kremlin and many Russians is the terrible history they've had, and their natural wish not to face it. The Soviet Union collapsed because it was founded on terrible murders and so on and so forth, and it wasn't able to reform itself. And that's the real problem. Russia, and the very idea that now they're erecting statues to Ivan the Terrible and going back to approving of Stalin shows a rejection of the terrible difficulty of facing up to their past. It's not the only country to have that sort of problem, but it's had very severe consequences because it's been easy to blame, particularly the United States. And it makes for a more comforting feeling inside Russia. And the fact that it's not true has got nothing to do with it. But the NATO story fits into that. So as Mateo said, in a way, it doesn't really matter if it's true or not, except that a lot of people in the West believe it too. I don't know if we're...
Thank you. Thank you both for that. I think at this time I'll ask you one question that we received from the audience, and then I'll have some additional questions that I think might take us a little further away from your specific myths, but they seem important questions to me. So dear speakers, thank you for a wonderful delivery on the myths. Mr. Bouleg has mentioned asymmetric warfare. Pro-Kremlin media regularly presents European countries to be dependent upon Russia's export in gas. Whereas if you look at Gazprom revenues from European countries, the picture is completely asymmetric. Gazprom seems to be more dependent on European countries. How does the Western media try to fight this kind of propaganda? This is the question we received from the audience. This was coincidentally one of the things, the whole Russia jumping in to be a savior when it comes to gas prices was going to be one of my questions. So it's good that we got this question, albeit from a slightly different angle.
So, and yeah, it would be good to have Andrew's take on that as well. But how do we find out? We don't, because we don't really recognize there's a problem in the first place, A, and B, we're just barely learning how to walk in terms of fighting and countering disinformation, let alone to sprint, as I was mentioning. You know, countries like Georgia, like Ukraine, have been at the forefront of these destabilizing actions and taking the full brunt of Russia's warfare capabilities, and not just, you know, tanks rolling in, but also influence operations and information warfare. You've learned to sprint before you could walk in terms of countering and debunking these narratives, all the wonderful activities done by your civil society in Georgia when it comes to, and the here as well when it comes to countering, you know, debunking these myths or fact-checking or increasing media literacy and critical thinking. So these are things that we're barely recognizing how to do. We have these Stratcom units, of course, at the EU and NATO level, but this is definitely not at the level we should have if we want to push back sufficiently, comprehensively, and potentially do what we call active defense, which is basically trying to take the fight back by being more proactive in our response. So we don't respond to these things because we still feel, you know, imbued by the learning curve of these things. So when it comes to gas dependence, it's not really, you know, it's treated in the mass media as we are held, and sorry for my French, but you know, Putin is holding us by the balls, quote unquote. I'm referring to a UK tabloid title on this. You know, Vlad's old scheme at you know, creating a sense of dependence of European energy security. So yes, it's true, but it's also a problem of our own doing in terms of constant failure at finding innovative sources and supplies of energy, or failure to be innovative in the way that we approach energy security in Europe, but also failure to hold on to our commitments. And I'm talking about Nord Stream 2. I mean, if we're having now these discussions about, well, we should have stopped it, and you know, we should have stopped the pipeline. Well, it's nice to say that, but we should have done that 10 years ago when it was first put on paper, if we had really wanted to do anything about it. Now that the pipeline is going online, that we can commiserate, you know, and talk in hindsight about how terrible it's going to be for energy security, how terrible it is for Ukraine in terms of the message we send, that we're sort of abandoning our allies as well by increasing our dependence on Russian gas. So it's also about being credible in our approach, right? And then avoiding this last minute, last second hypocrisy that we're projecting. So, you know, to answer, you know, the short answer to this great question is that we're not there yet. We're not there yet because we don't really have in Europe as such a consolidated view of what Russia represents in terms of challenge. It is treated at, you know, the level of the EU and NATO at 28, 29, 27 different understanding of what the Russia challenge is. It's, you know, and across all of Europe and NATO, certain parts of the body politic are between, you know, completely irrigated by Russian propaganda, paid for, used in terms of, you know, the useful idiots and the little helpers of Putin's policy. So we also have a lot of sins to atone for in our approach to the Russia challenge as well. So hence a complete lack of comprehensive and complete and unified and coherent approach to Russia policy in Europe, more specifically, because it is, even inside the body politic of all these countries, we have diverging opinions on what Russia really is in the first place. Is it a problem? Is it a threat? Is it a challenge? Or is it a help? If you look at Hungary for these days, for instance, Russia is definitely a friend. It's not a challenge. So.
Andrew, would you care to respond or comment on this? Perhaps.
Well, I agree. For example, we've actually got extensive gas supplies, but we didn't care to use them, partly because of the climate change, partly because of fear that fracking would be dangerous and so on and so forth. And I strongly agree with Mateo that within Europe, widely defined, there are a huge range of ideas. The Germans have quite reasonably acted in what they consider to be their own interests and have their own ambivalences towards Russia based on historical experience and so on and so forth. Similarly, Hungary has developed in one way, and I mean, it was mad of the Germans, for example, to scrap nuclear options when they did, and therefore to enlarge their carbon dioxide contribution by going back to coal. So we all make mistakes, and it's not true to say Europe has a single articulated voice. It doesn't, and in my view, it shouldn't have either. But that's getting into another thing.
That's beyond the debate.
Now, if you don't mind, I would like to ask you two questions. One will be more about Ukraine. The other one will be more, well, closer to Georgia centered. During our previous talk, the one we did with James, Katarina, and Ben, we mentioned the infamous, I guess, Trenin article about Ukraine. And then I think a couple of days ago, Medvedev published his article in the Kommersant. I don't know if you've seen it, but they're obviously they're two very different articles. They're written by two very different people. But I can't help but think about a comment that Katarina made when she said that Trenin never writes anything sort of out of the blue. It must be indicative of something happening. There must be something behind that. And then the Medvedev article comes out. Of course, both were understandably sort of offensive to the people of Ukraine and the leadership of Ukraine in their own term, whether it's for the wording that they use or for the way they construct the arguments. But I was wondering if you see any connection, I suppose, between the two, and can we expect any sort of change of policy in the direction of Ukraine? One thing that I personally it brought a smile to my face when Medvedev, in the conclusion of his article, he says, what should we do in relation to Ukraine? He says nothing. Let's just wait for there to be a more constructive leadership of that country. I don't know if Russia is necessarily known for peacefully waiting things out, but I was just wondering if there may be some sort of a connection between these two opinions put forth by Trenin and Medvedev. And with that, I will also ask Nico, I've sent you the links to both articles, the Medvedev article and the in an article, so post them in the comment section. That would be wonderful. But yeah, this is my question about the situation with Ukraine.
The language and actions in direction of Ukraine have become harsher and more militarily flavored than they were before. I hope that the discussions that Putin is supposed to have with Macron and Merkel will not touch too much on this area, but it seems to me that they will. That doesn't mean to say that I think that Ukraine will be invaded again soon, because that would be completely, well, the fact that it would be utterly stupid doesn't make a difference, but it would be very foolish indeed if they did that. But the threat to Ukraine, I think, is higher than it was. The effort to persuade people outside Ukraine that this is a situation caused by the government in Kiev and not by Moscow will certainly continue. The buildup of troops earlier this year was obviously a demonstration of the same nature. A lot depends, I think, on President Biden in this case to demonstrate American resolve. So yes, I do think that I didn't read the Trenin article because on the whole, I don't like reading Trenin's articles because they seem to me rather oily and not very clear as, well, they're quite clear, but he's got a knack of seeming tremendously reasonable, whereas actually he's seeing a very pro-Kremlin sort of tune. I do think they notch up the pressure on Ukraine and are meant to do so. And that goes with Belarus. We in the West have got rather used to the idea that somehow there'd be direct Russian intervention in Belarus. In some ways, they don't need that if they continue to build up what will amount to a Western deployment of Russian military forces into Belarus. If they continue, as they will, to try to maintain a Lukashenko type government there, that in itself is also indicative of a continuing resolve on the part of the Kremlin to hang on to what they reckon is their empire. The Putin letter was by no means an accident. It reflected a long-term Russian belief, which existed under Tsars as well. Any Slav language country is inherently theirs, in a rather general sense perhaps, or actual sense earlier. So I do think this is something we have to watch very carefully, yes. So supporting Ukraine is vital.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on what Andrew said, and I haven't read the Trenin article for other reasons, similar and other reasons, but yeah. But it's the Medvedev piece is a Medvedev piece. I mean, he is no longer influential if he's ever been in the Kremlin. He's doing a box ticking exercise of saying that Ukraine is run by fascists, that it's a CIA plot. There's a lot of borderline, very anti-Semitic references actually, about Zelensky. So it's what they do best, right? It's basically denying, and I agree with Andrew about the importance of the Putin long read, the Putin letter, that it's denying Ukraine its sense of identity. It's denying Ukraine its sense of own history and agency over its own existence. Now, basically what was the nature of the Putin letter, that there cannot be a Ukraine without a Russia behind it, let alone a sovereign independent Ukraine that is going towards NATO and the EU. That's, it's oxymoronic in this sense of the Putin letter. So I wouldn't give it too much attention apart from the fact that it's just a repeat of Russia standing its ground when it comes to the Minsk negotiations. That, you know, yes, they can wait it out and wait for time because they've been waiting it out since 2015. And that if you want to start negotiating, then you need to recognize the existence of the People's Republic, quote unquote, in Donetsk and Luhansk. And that's it. So it's basically, you know, restating against the political preconditions that could lead to discussion when Ukraine has been, and the Kiev leadership has been talking about security preconditions first. So we come back to where we are and where we've been since Minsk II in September 2015. So there's absolutely nothing new. And if the piece had been intended for a Western audience, then they wouldn't have had Medvedev write something in Kommersant. It would have been a much larger, much bigger media operation aimed at the West. Otherwise, it's just about, you know, playing on the usual, as I was saying, box ticking exercise of all these nasty things you have to say about Ukraine before you go into discussion. So that's mostly about Russia flexing the muscle before Putin goes into any discussions with Merkel and Macron on, oh yeah, but we know where we are, right? We stand our ground before we even have a discussion. And anyway, these Westerners won't achieve anything because first we need these political preconditions before we even sit down on the table. And the worst part in all of this is that nobody's discussing Crimea. Yeah. We remain completely strung out on management of Donbass at the level of Minsk and the OSCE working groups. But in the meantime, the more we do that, the more Crimea is slipping away from if it ever were, from international attention, and is slipping away from potential resolution and, you know, reappropriation into Ukraine after the annexation. So this is also the tragedy of it. And it works equally in a way when you look at the discussions concerning Georgia and concerning the separatist entities. It's sort of the same rhetoric as well in terms of appropriation with the same tactics of, you know, passportization and so on, and then slowly making them slip away from the sort of public consciousness, and specifically Western public consciousness. And this is highly dangerous for the future of Georgia and Ukraine, of course, in this sense.
Thank you both for that. Like I said, my other question would be a little more Georgia-centric or Georgia-focused, and this is something that Mateo and I discussed a little bit before we came into the call here. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the proposal of a 3+3 format, because this is something that a lot of people here in Georgia are very preoccupied by, and understandably so, because as we know, first voiced by the Turkish president, it was then sort of it seems to be the initiative of the Russian Federation for the 3+3 format between Russia, Turkey, and Iran, and then Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan on the other hand. So the smaller countries, smaller powers, and then the bigger sort of regional powers cooperating. Understandably, that proposal, well, first it was met by a complete sort of denial by Georgia that we're not even considering that format for obvious reasons. Then there was a somewhat, let me call it a controversial remark by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Georgia, where he said that it would be difficult for Georgia to cooperate with the Russian Federation in that format, but at the same time claiming that being a part of regional geopolitical projects is, of course, you know, an important thing for Georgia to achieve its foreign policy and development goals. So I think that there's little debate about the idea that, yes, of course, we need to be a part of regional projects and geopolitical projects and all of that, but the fact that that statement was a little blurry around whether or not we are considering that specific format, which includes Russia, it has sort of caused a lot of backlash here in Georgia. I was wondering if we could go maybe do a little overview of what you think of that format, what purpose it might serve, and whether or not there are any benefits that the countries like Georgia could see in a format like that.
can start, or unless Andrew, you want to take a look, to reply. But so yeah, it's really hard, honestly, to imagine anything happening from an official channel of 6, states from the Caucasus country and around that are either at war or in a direct conflict with each other, sitting down discussing, what Erdogan calls peace and stability in the region. We are nowhere near building peace and security, where some countries are at war with each other. So yes, Russia has been twisting the arm of Armenia to sit down and consider the offer. Obviously, they can't do it as much with Azerbaijan and Georgia, but it is a fallacy to think, to hope that there can be any sense of peace and stability in the region without addressing the protracted conflict. I'm not saying frozen conflicts, but the protracted conflict and the deep suspicions and absolute lack and absence of confidence building possible on this. So I think it's a failed initiative from the get-go. It's also a good way to test the waters about how regional dynamics are changing. It's a good way for Russia to balance out its influence in the region with external players. Turkey and Iran have had, of course, an important part of the foreign policy in the South Caucasus. So it is definitely part of this. I think there's a big China component about it as well that is not official on the agenda yet, but there might be a China component when it comes to defining together the level of acceptable Chinese presence in the region. It comes to infrastructure, development, investments, and so on, that Russia might be leading as a back channel. But apart from that, there is no clear end game. There is no clear logic, and there is no clear topic of discussion beyond, achieving peace and whatever. So I don't really see it as an acceptable format of discussion for anyone on board due to pre-existing grievances, conflicts, and wars, and if not hate from country to the other. So probably not going to lead to much, but you have to admit the importance and way of testing the waters for geopolitical rebalancing, whether it's internal or external when it comes to China, I would argue.
Thank you, Mateo. Andrew, would you like to comment on that?
The Rolling Stones had a very good song called My, said the spider to the fly. That's easy for me to fit it.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. No, I mean, the reason I asked this question is that understandably that proposal has caused a lot of conversations, a lot of anger at even, the proposal. And then I think the tone, especially of Lavrov, where he expressed hope that Georgia would sort of find it in itself to see the value of this proposal and see the value of this cooperation. Yeah, I mean, it is currently being widely discussed by political entities as well as expert circles. So it is definitely of interest to the general population here. Nico, I've also sent you 2 articles about the 3+3 format. One is, they're both by prominent Georgian scholars. One is by Nino Samkharadze from DRI, and one is by Natia Sescuria. I was wondering if you could post those articles in the comment section, because they present very interesting arguments as to what Georgia's potential engagement with this format could look like, what Georgia could expect from that type of proposals coming out of, or involving Russia, and the risks that this format might also pose for Georgia's European and Euro-Atlantic integration and its relationship with the partners. Now that I've abused of everyone's time for over an hour, let me look if we have any questions. Let me see if we have any questions. I'm not seeing any questions, but I do think that we did a good job today of staying in the agreed upon 90 minutes format, because the first one we did, I think it was I abused of everyone's time far beyond what I think was acceptable, but I am grateful to everyone. So I think with that said, unless you have any sort of concluding thoughts or remarks about the things that we discussed today, I will express my most sincere gratitude to both of you. Andrew, I think you were saying something?
I was going to say thank you, because I think these sorts of conversations are inherently useful. You can go back after and say, I didn't say that quite right, or that gave me to think this or that or the other. So that's why discussion is always good.
Yeah.
Not everyone can agree on everything, but Georgia is a very special place in my heart anyway. So
well, I hope that in the nearest future we can either find or create opportunities for you to come back to Georgia, of course, once it's safe and, you know, in terms of COVID and everything. Mateo, that includes you as well. I hope to bring you to Georgia one day.
I would love to.
And Andrew, as you said, I mean, these discussions, I do firmly believe that these discussions are not only useful, but they are indispensable for countries like Georgia to be able to reflect about the issues that represent almost an existential threat, and I suppose a threat to its national security. So once again, I truly honestly believe that the effort put into translating this publication into Georgian was worth every second and every penny invested in it. I hope that I take it has been reposted in the comment section of this particular thought. So once again, I encourage everyone to read that publication. It is outstanding. It has been authored by the most prominent field experts. And then I think that these conversations as well, they serve a purpose. I did say this in the conclusion part of the first talk that we had about this, that my goal with these conversations is not just blind, rage-based Russia bashing. No, not really. What I'm calling for and what I'm advocating for is for a more in-depth analysis of, again, what Russia is, how it's run, where it's going, and how it wields its power. I think it is indispensable for countries like Georgia, and I hope that everyone has enjoyed reading the publication, either in English or in Georgian. I hope that everyone has enjoyed these two talks that we've organized. If the other authors of, if the authors of the other myths should have the time in the future, I'm always available for that. The door of GCSD is always open for these kinds of discussions and the exchange of sort of ideas. So again, thank you all very much. Thank you to Chatham House, everyone involved, everyone I mentioned in the introduction for helping me put this together. Mateo, Andrew, thank you for today.
Thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure.
My best regards to James, Katerina, and Ben. Good luck to Ben with his book, and I will read it soon. I can't wait to read it. I'm waiting for my copy. And then, yeah, I mean, last but never ever the least, thank you to my team for helping me put this together. I'm grateful to the gods of internet for making sure that the connection doesn't fail today, or that there are no Facebook outages today, because there was a real risk of that. And I mean, I would like to end this conversation with the hope of many more, of more in-depth sort of discussions where we look at some of the most pressing international issues. Thank you to everyone involved, and everyone have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.